season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have workers from their toil? Holy wisdom, holy word.
Thanks be to God.
Hear what the Spirit is saying.
I love this scripture, Ecclesiastes 3, ever since I first heard it sung by Peter, Paul, and Mary when I was growing up. Yes, I grew up in the 60s. You don't have to do the math. So it got into my psyche. It became a part of who I am. And while the original writer of Ecclesiastes might have been a bit of a skeptic, perhaps saying that everything had a prescribed order, I am generally an optimist. Even though sometimes it's hard. Like right now, it's hard to be an optimist. I like to try to see grace in everything. I like to see or think that everything happens in God's time, that there's a time for everything under heaven. And if we are attuned to God's grace, then we receive the grace that God has in everything that happens. Even when things don't go the way we expect them to go, or the future seems uncertain, the one thing that always remains is God's grace. There's grace in birth and death. There's grace in planting and uprooting. There's grace in hurts and healing. There's grace in tearing down and building up. There's grace in weeping and laughing. There's grace in mourning and dancing. There's grace in scattering and gathering. There's grace in embracing and refraining from embracing. There's grace in searching and giving up. There's grace in keeping and giving away. There's grace in tearing and mending. There's grace in silence and in speaking. There's grace in loving and hating sin. There's grace even in war and especially in peace. But as I realized that as I say that from a place of privilege. Because for the most part, my life is not in danger. And I'm not in need of a meal. I'm not searching for a way just to be in the world. But that doesn't mean that grace isn't there. It just means that we need to work harder to be that grace for those people who are not as privileged as we are. It means that we need to take a look at our privilege and see how we can leverage it so that we can be grace to others. Grace in our lives. Sometimes when we're going through a difficult time, we only see grace in hindsight. It's easier to look back upon our experiences and find the grace than it is to know it for what it is in the moment. What is grace? Grace is not justice. Justice is getting what we deserve. Justice is everyone enjoying the rights that they deserve. Grace is not mercy. Grace is getting better than we deserve. Grace is not something you can ever get, but only be given. The grace of God means something like, here is your life. You might never have been, but you are, because the party wouldn't have been complete without you. Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen, but don't be afraid, for I am with you. Nothing can ever separate us. It's as if God says, it is for you that I created the universe. It's as if God says, I love you. There's only one catch. Like any other gift, grace is only yours if you reach out or if you are ready to receive it. Actually, I don't like the image of reaching out because that kind of is like, you're going to bring it to me. You just have to have your hands ready to receive the gifts. What does grace look like? Well, the hymn that we just sang, it's long been a favorite among the churched and the unchurched. It routinely appears as America's favorite hymn. The Library of Congress actually says that this hymn has been recorded by more performers than any other. And way back in 1990, that's actually when I was here as your associate pastor, Bill Moyer slipped into this phenomenon and made an 80-minute PBS special focusing on the amazing qualities of these words for a startling broad range of Americans. And that documentary drew 2 to 5 times the number of viewers that a typical PBS special attracts. Bill Moyer's words himself stunned at the power of the hymn, that it has wielded in the lives of people from all walks of life. In the film, soprano Jessie Norman, that beautiful African-American singer, speculates on whether the special power of this hymn might be its marriage of words written by a repentant slave trader to a melody that might have arisen from the slave community itself. Imagine that. As made clear by Moyer's interviews, grace does not always come yoked to good times or happy circumstances. As well as being amazing grace can also come as suffering grace, difficult grace, painful grace, costly grace, illogical grace. Yet despite its various disguises, grace is always sufficient grace. When I went to seminary, one of the folks that I got to know there was a young South African woman, white. This was during the time of apartheid. And becoming her friend opened my eyes to what was going on in South Africa at the time of apartheid. Because amongst the people that she knew and worked with were the folks that were struggling against apartheid. Her bishop was Desmond Tutu. She felt a call to ministry. And at that time, the Anglican Church, of which she was a part, did not ordain women. She was one of the first 3 women ordained to the priesthood in South Africa. And so the stories that arose out of that time in South Africa strike me in a way that I would not have known without knowing my friend Wilma. So I want to tell you a grace story from that time. Grace is amazing, as in this story. Andrew Young, former ambassador to the United Nations, and one of the associates of Martin Luther King Jr. He tells about an experience he had in South Africa when he was visiting at the invitation of Nelson Mandela. For years, Mandela was a leading opponent of apartheid, South Africa's official policy of racial segregation and violence. In 1964, the white establishment locked Mandela up for life, but as his legend grew, so did the worldwide campaign to set him free. And he was released in 1990. And when apartheid was abolished and South Africa held its first democratic elections in the spring of 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president. 13 months later, Mandela invited Andrew Young to be his guest when South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup tournament. Now, in South Africa, rugby was a white man's game, and the South African team at that point, like most rugby teams there, was entirely white. And South Africa is about 80% black, so even though the World Championship was being played right there in Johannesburg, there was a deliberate absence of support for the team. And as the tournament approached, a heated debate broke out about the South African team's symbol, a leaping gazelle, called the Springbok. And you might have heard this or seen this story in the movie Invictus. Most of the white Afrikaners, the Springbok has been the symbol of every rugby team they've ever had. And most black South Africans said, exactly. It reminds us of South Africa's racist history and we want it changed. And it was an explosive situation. And Mandela had impeccable sensibilities, and he understands and understood the saving power of grace. And so a few days before the opening game, Mandela visited the South African team. And after the visit, he called a press conference. Mandela showed up to that press conference wearing a rugby jersey and an athletic cap with the team mascot, the Springbok, on it. Media recorded it all. And Mandela said that until the elections, he and most other black people in South Africa had always supported whoever was playing against the Springboks. Against the Springboks. It's sort of like us in ASU. We root for whoever is the U of A and whoever's playing ASU, right? Well, it would be sort of like us here in Tucson rooting for ASU and anybody playing against U of A. You get the drift. He said, Mandela said, regardless of the past, he said, these are our boys now. They may all be white, but they're our boys, and we must get that behind them and support them in the tournament. And the next day, the Springboks coach did something interesting. He sent word to his players not to show up to practice in their practice gear. He told them to wear their suits and ties, and so he took them out to Robben Island, to the prison where Nelson Mandela had spent almost 3 decades of his life behind bars. The coach and every player on the team walked into that small cell. And as they stood there, the coach said, this is the cell where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned. He was kept here for 27 years by the racist policies of our government. The Afrikaners tolerated his imprisonment for all those years, and yet he has backed us publicly. We cannot let him down. And all through the tournament, the Springboks played above their heads. And to everyone's surprise, they won game after game, and they finally made it to the final game against the New Zealand team, which is a perennial favorite if you follow rugby. It's sort of like Slippery Rock playing Notre Dame. Okay? And yet, at the end of the regulation time of that game, the game was tied. he brought a South African children's choir out of the stands, and they sang an old African miners' song, which to them would be sort of like singing Sweet Low, Sweet Chariot was to the slaves in this country. And within minutes, 65,000 people in the stadium were standing and singing this black African miners' song. And Andy Young, the American, said, "I don't know anything about rugby, and I don't understand the words of the song, but I was in tears." And when, after that timeout, the Springboks took the field, they were unstoppable, and they won the World Championship. And for the next 24 hours, something unthinkable happened. Whites danced with blacks in the streets of South Africa. One of the most divided nations on the planet was united by something a lot of people consider insignificant, a rugby match, but God used it to help heal a nation. What does grace look like 29 years on from there? What does grace look like today? Well, I can tell you a story of what grace looked like for me 22 years ago. I had just changed churches. I was in parish ministry still at that point, and I had served a very conflicted church for 2 years. At which time, the first year I was there, I was pregnant, and the second year I was there was my daughter's first year of life. This congregation, part of our conference, not here in Tucson, was not a friendly place to be pregnant or to have a small child. They had spent $250,000 renovating their sanctuary, and I was tasked with developing a family ministry. And yet when they moved back into the big house, I was tasked, since it was a small group, we were set to use the social hall, which was kind of small and old, and it didn't have anything but folding chairs and folding tables. And I was tasked with making that a creative space. And I borrowed the usher's table, which was wooden, so we could have a communion table. And I got in trouble for that. And I had a young lady, a mother of 2 youth, who had done her interior design degree. And we didn't have pyramids for the communion table. And so she designed and then went and got some fabric and the different liturgical colors and designed some basic pyramids for us to use. And we got a big glass bowl to be our font. And we got glass cups and plates for our communion. And all in all, we spent about $200. And the seamstresses of the church turned those designs into beautiful pyramids. And I got in trouble for spending $200. And I can tell you more stories, but it wasn't a welcoming place, and it was a struggle. And I was moved to a church not far down the street to be an associate, and it was a congregation called Grace, and it was a grace. But one of the things that graceful moments happened in that first week, and my daughter was one and a half at the time, and And so I needed to have her for part of the day when my siblings weren't looking after her. I need to have her in my office, which was just a little ways down from the senior pastor's office. And that first week, and you might know this senior pastor because he was here for a while. He's a tall fella by the name of Tom. Not Messmore, sorry. But here, you know how tall Tom is. I know how short I am. But yeah, we served together. It was fun. But that first week, when I had Sarah in my office, I heard this squeaky voice calling my daughter's name. Sarah, Sarah, where are you, Sarah? It was Tom. And he was crawling on his hands and knees so that he would be Sarah's height, right? He was crawling on his hands and knees from his office to my office. That was grace. That was grace to me. It's small gestures, it's large gestures. Grace, it's a funny thing because when we offer grace to others, we get the gift right back, right? It's funny how God makes those things happen. What are the ways in these troubled times that you and I are called to be grace for others? For there's a time for everything under the sun. Yeah, we're going to get back to that scripture. For everything there is a season. What season is it here at Christ Church, where the motto is people caring for people? And people caring for people. What does it look like? What does it look like when we come for communion? Are we welcoming all? Are the things that we do, how are we opening this place to all people? Grace upon grace upon grace upon grace. What are the ways that you have felt grace in these days? What are the ways that you can offer grace in these days? It is in how you speak. It is on how you act. It is in what you do for members of your family, of your church family. It's how you extend yourself to others. For everything there is a season. What season is it here besides summer? How can we be grace to others in that soul enlivening, soul touching grace? You look at each other, take a moment and look at each other. I see faces that I've seen over these last 30 years, welcoming me back to this place. I see people who have been grace to me, and hopefully have been grace to them. But we need to tell the stories of what grace we have seen and what grace we have been, and we need in this time to figure out the ways that we can be grace for others, and who that might look like and what we might look like. And it might take us looking at what privileges we enjoy. How can we perhaps set aside some of that privilege in order to privilege others? That is grace. That is grace. And when you extend it, you receive it back in amazing ways. May each of you, may each of us, may each of everyone outside of these walls find grace